It's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to the plenary session, the BYU Focus Day for our seminar on mapping the intersections between faith and scholarship. We had a delightful day yesterday, and I'm anxious to have us engage in conversation now about exploring how that all applies to BYU in a variety of ways. We have throughout the day, starting with this morning's session, a variety of wonderful, thoughtful colleagues from a variety of disciplines and perspectives. And so we'll see if we can facilitate. Last night, the last session, there was a little comment about we're not Jewish enough. I think that was Lynn that was saying we've got to we've got to have more debate like the Jewish people you grew up with. Is that right? And we never disagree, and Jim disagreed with you that we never disagree. So I think we had a pretty good start for the sense of this is informal, this is an opportunity for us to dialogue with each other, to say, here's how I see it. There's not a one-size-fits-all, and that was part of the point of listening to the Jacobsons, as they said, here are things from a variety of different religious traditions and perspectives, and certainly variation within those. And so, do we have a kind of tradition? Where do I fit in that tradition? What works at BYU? What would be helpful? What did we learn? Those are the goals for today, both in terms of scholarship. We said scholarship, but we meant to be all-encompassing. It includes teaching. We'll have some sessions on teaching, as well as the scholarly work in terms of research and creative activity. I've asked Jim Gordon from the law school if he'd offer a word of prayer to get us started this morning. And then I want to just introduce the panel and our approach for this morning, but hope that you'll feel our desire to engage one another in this process. Could I just acknowledge some of the people that Jim mentioned by category in his prayer? Jane Birch is the behind-the-scenes energy and activity, arms and head, and wonderful partner in helping pull this conference together. Those of you who are panelists have had frequent conversation and connection with her and know how involved she's been. Sue Roper back here with the arrangements, an organization. She's a master of organization, and I don't see the other Sue who have helped you, but we've had several from the Faculty Center who have helped us. Could you just join me in a round of applause? Thank you, Dan. Sue and Jane wanted me to invite you to put name tags on. Some of you took them home and have still got them in your pocket, perhaps. And so we want to facilitate knowing one another's names and communicating with each other, and that would help. Let me just do now something that occurred to me as I was driving in this morning, but several of you didn't have the chance to come yesterday. Some of you have had a chance to we've sent you readings that would give you some feel for what we discussed yesterday, even if you weren't part of each of the sessions. But I would like to list, and I was going to put them on the overhead, but I was vetoed. We wanted to have this open. We have to close the blinds to be able to have a PowerPoint show up. And so rather than putting them on PowerPoint, they're really in your outline if you got a handout from yesterday. But I think the Jacobsons left us with a series of questions. Rather than think about the content they presented, I'd like to focus us on the kinds of questions that they invited us to consider and to see how we apply those to ourselves during the day-to-day, including a question that I would ask you to consider, which was part of what Jim was just praying about as well. What would the Lord inspire me to do about this? What kinds of ideas might I pursue? What sorts of experiments in my scholarship, in my teaching, might I want to experiment with based on what I've been hearing and feeling? And so I hope that's the overall question that in the last session this afternoon I'd like to ask. What are the themes you've heard, and what are you going to try? And how can we help you? So that's how the day is designed, to not necessarily get the true answer, but stimulate your thinking, open you to inspiration and some sense of what you might experiment with and how we could help each other. Here are the questions that I heard yesterday. The one they ended with, which I think they and I would suggest we start with is, do I have a sense of vocation? Or in the Latin vocare, the sense of, do I feel called? I'm not sure. They were not quite as focused on from God. That is, has He given me gifts? And do I have a sense of inspiration? Does this relate to my patriarchal blessing? Whatever it is, what are my living questions was the way they asked it. Do I have living questions? Jake's was the one in the many. How do we bring people together in their diversity? You remember Rhonda's was something about how much can I help people heal? And how much can they heal? What is the question or questions? They were then saying, who is your primary audience? Are there scholars? Is it the world? The church? At my table, as we discussed it, they said, well, it's my students. Well, who's your primary audience? I think all of the above might be the audience for several, but who is your primary audience in the sense of pursuing these living questions and then sharing and involving them in the answers? What is your orientation? They thought both religiously and in terms of yourself as a scholar. Religiously, is your orientation to focus primarily on beliefs, primarily on practices, primarily on affections, or some combination thereof? And they gave us examples of various places. A Calvin college that is very focused on beliefs and a kind of framework, a system of theology, and they've got great analytic philosophers. Was that it, Jim? Something like that. But what is our orientation in terms of our religious approach, and what in terms of a scholarly approach? Is it analytic? Is it strategic or action-oriented? Is it empathic in the sense of feeling, inspiration, etc.? And then what kind of approach do I take to that? Does mine look more like the conflictual approach that they use the Reformed Church as an example of the conflictual approach, taking on the academy and the assumptions in the academy using a gospel perspective? Is it compatible, more like the Catholics, a sense of universal? Things will come together if we really pursue our scholarship, and the truth will out, and we'll find patterns that are compatible. Or is it paradoxical? They use the Lutheran example. Or is it functional? That is, neutral in the sense of the Anabaptists, who didn't see truth or knowledge as being either good or bad, but it could be used for good or ill, and use it for good. And so it was more about service and action. And then finally, the question: how do those orientations apply to me, indeed, but also to BYU or some LDS perspective? Is ours like one of these kinds of orientations, or is it something else? Well, I think those are thoughtful questions that I hope stimulate some who am I, where are we? And that's what this panel is about today. We've got subsequent panels that will focus on getting more into specifically what do individual faculty members do in their scholarship or teaching, and some kinds of issues that have come out of our research and interviews with faculty this afternoon that are even more specifically applied to our questions and issues at BYU. But this session is one where I have specifically asked these panelists, thoughtful people with lots of experience at BYU, to think about BYU and BYU implications of what we heard yesterday. Certainly they'll bring their own examples in, but I'm trying to ask them to think about, and are those examples shared by others? Is this not just your point of view, but as you've been on rank and status committees and in various university administrative or other service kinds of responsibilities, as you've engaged in your scholarship and teaching, does this feel representative of at least a significant part of BYU? So BYU, or a significant part thereof, is the unit of analysis for this panel. What are the implications? What did they hear about the questions? How would they critique, agree, apply the kinds of things that we heard? My intention, just so you'll know before I introduce each of them and get them started, my intention is really to engage you, to not have us be giving lots of long speeches, and we've sort of prepared each other for that. But I'm going to try to get us to during the first 15 minutes or so, reflect quite broadly on what is it that most piqued your interest for good or for ill. I know got your dander up or really inspired you yesterday from what you heard from the Jacobsons that might relate to BYU. And I've asked the panelists to just take 2 minutes each and say, here's the key idea that most interested me, the question I'd most like to pursue. But I want you to be thinking about that, because then I'm going to turn to you very quickly to say, okay, let's get 5, 10, 15 quick these are 30-second, these are not long speeches, but just let's get a sense of the variety of reactions to what you heard yesterday, or if you've just got the readings, to what you've read from the Jacobsons as it applies to BYU. So we get a sense of the range of reactions that people were taking away from yesterday. And then I'll ask each of the panelists to address the questions that I framed in your program. And we'll take each question at a time. If one of the panelists, we don't have to have each of the panelists respond to each question, but if someone wants to respond to that and to each other, we'll take that for a few minutes. But then I'll turn to you. What do you want to say about that question, or ask the panelists about that question, and we'll proceed through those questions. Do you find them in your program? Those are the questions that you can start thinking about how you would like to respond to it. So this is intended to be panelists with wide experience stimulating some application kinds of questions, but getting you into the conversation. So if you'll enter into the spirit of that, I think this will work beautifully. Let me just introduce our panelists. Bob Barrett has taught at BYU since the fall of 1982 in the illustration program in the Department of Visual Arts. He's taught classes from foundation drawing through senior studio, also taught the history of American illustration, and just finished a 3-year assignment teaching Doctrine and Covenants. So taught religion and drawing and history of drawing and art. He served as chair of the design department as well as associate dean in the College of Fine Arts and Communications. He's currently serving in the academic review committee, has served on rank and status committees at the department, college, and university levels, and has received the Carl G. Mazur Award twice, once for teaching, once for scholarship. So you see a broad level of experience, and he may not have wanted me to share all of that. Jim didn't give me anything to share, so I'm going to make something up about him. Professor of philosophy. That'll be better?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe not. Professor of philosophy whose focus has been continental philosophy, both in his research and teaching. He currently occupies the Richard L. Evans Chair of Religious Understanding. Past service as Dean of Undergraduate Studies, Associate Director in the Faculty Center. He served as Department Chair in Philosophy. Very involved in the life of the mind at BYU. He regularly sponsors an interdisciplinary kind of book reading of some philosopher and thinking about the underpinnings of our theories of our work at BYU, and not just in philosophy. So wonderful service that he has provided. Then Ross Spencer will be next. Ross has been at BYU for 25 years, and his research is focused on the physical properties of hot gases. He does theory and computer modeling, so his students learn to solve equations and write computer code. Sounds very religious, Ross. I'm sure you'll have something fascinating to say about that. He served on the University Presidential Scholarship Committee, served as graduate coordinator and on the university's graduate council, currently the chair of physics and astronomy. He says his teaching hasn't had much of a focus. He's taught undergraduates and graduates, and both beginning and advanced, and has taught, but he does say the thing that he thinks is the emphasis is figuring out how mathematics can be a tool to understanding physical processes. Thoughtful and wonderful contributor to BYU. Richard Williams has been a faculty member at BYU for 29 years. He's a professor of psychology with an emphasis in theory and philosophy, as well as research methods and statistics. His interests have been in areas such as human agency and the philosophical underpinnings of the social sciences. He's taught religion courses regularly. He served 9 years in the academic vice president's office with responsibility for faculty hiring and faculty development. And he's currently the director of the Wheatley Institution, where he directs scholarly work in areas where they hope to contribute to the strength and viability of key social institutions. Well, I think you can see we have a panel with wide, diverse experience at BYU, and have had a chance to think about BYU as a whole. that I hope will stimulate our thinking about how does this apply to us as a community at BYU. So if we could start, Bob, 2 minutes each. Bob, then did I say, yeah, Jim, then Ross, and then Richard.
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I applaud the opportunity to be more communal about the discussions. That was something that I found in the book on scholarship and Christian faith by the Jacobsons. Christian scholars actually do have an obligation to be communal in nature and not so compartmentalized, which I think is a great limitation and obviously a predisposition of the academy. But what also prompted me through the readings and also through some of the discussion yesterday was this question of what is foundational to us, both in our own university documents and in the broader prophetic statements. I came across a few quotes, and I told Alan, just in the concern for time, I might just read those. "We should be a people of profound learning pertaining to the things of the world," said Brigham Young, but without being tainted by pernicious atheistic influences. Consistent with the mission and aims of a BYU education, Lorenzo Snow said, "We ought to understand that we have espoused a system of religion that is calculated in its nature to increase within us wisdom and knowledge. The whole idea of Mormonism is improvement, mentally, physically, morally, and spiritually. No halfway education suffices for the Latter-day Saint." In our BYU University policy on rank and status, we read, "The purpose of scholarship and creative work at its highest level is to serve God and humanity. According to the document, scholarship should contribute to the university's mission and should achieve one of the following objectives. It should improve the education of the minds and the spirits of students, contribute to the expansion of truth throughout the world, facilitate the solution of pressing world problems, or enhance the quality of people's lives." German philosopher Goethe said, "We are shaped and fashioned by the things we love. Scholars are fashioned by the things they love." In the Book of Mormon, we read how Nephi lamented over those who will not search knowledge nor understand great knowledge. We are told that scholarly work brings faculty to the frontiers of their disciplines. Scholarship is an important and indeed necessary part of the purpose of Brigham Young University. The opportunity to join in the quest for new knowledge and understanding, to contribute to the process of artistic performance, expression, or creation, and to improve the quality of life should be reason enough for participation, especially when the possibility exists to integrate religious values with secular learning. It has been said that if Brigham Young University did only that which other universities do, and in the same way, there would be little reason for the church to operate it. Elder Neil A. Maxwell said, "We need not be fearful of facts. Nothing lasting will come out of the territory of truth, or appear suddenly on the frontier of fact that cannot be incorporated with the gospel of Jesus Christ. True believers, as Alma used the term, are also true scholars." Elder Maxwell continued, "BYU is now in a position to turn its face outward to the world without having to explain itself too self-consciously. The LDS scholar has his citizenship in the kingdom, but he carries his passport into the professional world, not the other way around." And I looked at some other policy summaries from 1994, which I won't take the time to go into now, but they really do encourage us in a very thoughtful way to look at ways that we can integrate both the rigor of our scholarship with the rigor of a religious dimension. Thanks.
Jim?
Yesterday, one of the things that struck me particularly was the idea that there's some correlation between the metaphysical ideas that a particular religion has and the way in which it approaches scholarship. And I was thinking about that as we talked at our table, and we had an interesting result that at our table we thought, well, of the four choices, the Catholic and the Anabaptist seemed to describe Mormons best, and we were quite convinced that the Calvinists didn't at all. only to have Richard Williams stand up and go for Calvinism. So it really, I don't know what that means. In fact, I'm not sure how much connection there is between, metaphysical ideas about the nature of reality or something on the one hand, and then everyday practices on the other. But I really have been thinking about that since then, and wondering whether there are things about Latter-day Saint belief that make us think about teaching and learning and scholarship differently than we would if we were of another religious mindset. I mean, for example, it seems to me that the fact that ultimately Latter-day Saints are materialists, that means that we don't think about transcendence in the same way that other religions do. In fact, what they would call transcendence, we think of as just there's no such thing. We don't. Generally, I think we deny the kind of transcendence, this otherworldly, metaphysical God. We have a God who is in time and space, who is embodied, who works with us. And so I wonder what kinds of effects those ideas have on the ways we go about doing things. Do they have too little effect? Do they have, should they have more effect? Do they have any effect? And for me, it just is a question more than it is an insight. I really do wonder how much connection there is between our religious ideas and the ways we think about learning.
Thank you. Ross?
The thing that struck me the most, thinking about the readings, and as we listened to them yesterday, was their feeling that students wanted meaning. And as I saw that in the reading, my first thought was, well, that doesn't apply to us. Our students come with a sense of meaning in their lives. When I thought about it some more, I realized that these students, especially the freshmen when they first get here, have had seminary teachers who didn't think much of science, and science teachers who didn't think much of religion. And now they think, oh, finally, I'm at BYU. We're going to join those two. And as I thought about the way I've taught my classes, I don't think I've done very much of that. When I was hired here, I was interviewed by Elder Brewerton, and he read me J. Reuben Clark's statement about how the gospel of Jesus Christ should be involved in our teaching and the charge of Brigham Young to Carl G. Mazer. And I honestly said to him, I appreciate that, but I don't know how I would do that in a physics class. And he smiled for a minute and thought, and he said, well, if you stand in front of your students and they know that you're a scientist and they also know that you're a faithful member of the church, that helps. And I said, okay, I can do that. But I'm not sure I have, actually. When I stand up in front of my students, I'm not sure they know who I am, know anything about the faith side of my life. And so I'm going to try to do a better job of that, maybe have a little devotional every other class period and open it up for questions and respond to them and try to give them a sense of what it's like to both be a scientist and to be a faithful member of the church. Do a better job of that than I have in the past.
Thank you.
I need to pick up, I think, on a question that Jim raised, because it's been a central question for me, and that was the thing that was most impressed upon me yesterday. I think that all of the Jacobsons' approaches to scholarship and learning apply to us, that all four of them do. But I am convinced that owing to some very important but sometimes subtle differences in our religious knowledge and convictions, they don't apply in exactly the same way. That is, we will be doing something slightly different from what any other religious group would be doing under those same circumstances. And I think that the reason for that is closely related to why it is that we do not profess to have, and thankfully do not have, a theology, but we have a cosmology. We have a set of things we take to be true, and they are true because they just happen to be the case. That is, that God has a body as tangible as man's is not the result of careful philosophical deliberation. It is the case or it's not. And most of our grounding truths, I believe, at the end of the day will be shown to be of that sort. So, having had to stand up and declare myself a Calvinist and an integrationist, there is a subtle difference between my motivation, I hope, and my methods for doing that, not to bring an orthodoxy of belief. As a people and as a church, we have allowed people to believe almost what they want. If you think of the Temple Recommend interviews, they're not phrased in terms of what do you believe, but do you have a testimony and what do you do? But I think there are some things that we can believe and teach that make it more difficult for people to understand, to repent, to understand and keep their covenants, and to have an explanation for why. And we need to explore those things. And if there are some knowledge, some bits of knowledge, learning theories that make that more difficult, then I take it upon myself to try to examine that and see if that knowledge is worth having. I mentioned at our table yesterday that we are taught that by the time Joseph Smith came on the scene, all the contemporary religions were wrong together. And we learn from Elder Talmage and others that one of the reasons they went wrong was that they had incorporated Western philosophy, Greek philosophy, in one way or another. And so it stretches my credulity a bit to believe that those ideas were, the result of those ideas was that all the religions went wrong, but virtually all of the scholarly disciplines weren't harmed by them in some way. So I've taken it upon myself just to be cautious, to be as skeptical in my own scholarly work as I am in my religious beliefs. Just what are the implications of this? What is the foundation? Does it make connection with what we know to be the case? And in my own scholarly work, I've tried to subject those kinds of ideas to the most rigorous analysis that I could. But I don't use my religion to attack the ideas in order to achieve some sort of orthodoxy. My conviction is if they're really wrong, if they don't jibe with that state of affairs we know to be true, then they're wrong of their own merit and can be shown to be intellectually inadequate as well. So that's been what's animated my career, and I guess that's a species of integrationism, but I think of a very different sort. And most of what we do, I think Jim's right about this, while it may not appear radically different on the surface, underneath, I think whatever we do will be very different.
Thank you. We're doing pretty well. We didn't do 2 minutes each, but some thoughtful responses. Let's get some from you. I'm not looking for speeches, but key ideas or questions, disagreements. What did you pull out of yesterday or the readings, if you've done those and weren't here? Please.
It occurred that all the other religious traditions we heard about have allowed science and scholarship to influence religious beliefs as much as religion influences scholarship. And I feel as Mormonism or LDS does not do that yet. I wonder, can we get to that point? Is that even desirable? Or are we stopping to be what we are if we get to the point where we say we allow science to change theological ideas and doctrine?
Interesting. Okay, should the influence be
Question I have.
mutual?
Can I jump in a second?
Alan, repeat what people say, okay?
Yeah. I think what you're saying is, in the Jacobson's terms, they were talking about faith influencing learning, and you're saying, but they were also talking about learning or science influencing faith. Should we do that in our setting? What would that be? Richard doesn't believe we have a theology. By the way, neither does Jim. He didn't come out and say that, but I think I've heard him say that before, in terms of a formal framework or system of belief. And so in some ways that might influence, but at least there's an interesting question there. Would it influence our doctrine?
Fire people if they assert certain things that contradict us. So that's what I want.
So how should that relationship be? Let's keep going. I want to
Can
just
I
see if
jump
there...
in a minute here? Because I know just a little bit about this. There is one case I know of where science has influenced the way at least something is practiced in the church. There's a long history in the church of seminary teachers bashing evolution. That battle was fought here on campus a long time ago as well. And when the brethren train seminary teachers, they tell them to lay off of that.
And at BYU, we have an evolution packet that talks
Yeah.
about statements of the First Presidency that say, let the scientists worry about that because we don't really know how it was done. We know why it was done.
And I think if there hadn't been faithful LDS scientists here at BYU and elsewhere, I don't think we would have gotten to that point.
Now, you're violating my script here. I'm just trying to get a series of other things rather than respond to that question. It's a provocative one, and I think we'll get back to it, it sounds like. But are there other kinds of, and different perhaps? Paul?
Trying to say something I learned from Jim some years ago, and by the story which he told of a student that he had who would come to him to express his concerns about his faith and the challenges of belief, who eventually left our university to go to Utah and still maintained contact with Jim. Now, Jim knew him well enough to know his personal life, which wasn't even conformity to the scriptures. And at one time, when he finally came down, I guess Jim was getting a little tired of it, he said, look, as long as you're doing this, there's nothing I can say that will help you. And I think we get in that sense that religious knowledge, unlike any other knowledge, is behaviorally dependent. And we will not know if we do not live the commandments. And I think one of the best things we can do in our classes is to be an example of the believer by living the commandments. And then will that be that light that is built upon a hill.
There's an LDS take about how does our behavior, Jim was asking the question, how do our metaphysical beliefs influence our scholarship, our activity? You're turning it around. How do our behaviors, keeping the commandments, influence what we can learn, what kind of light and truth we can understand? Wonderful question. And how does that influence then the way we teach, our scholarship? Wonderful question. Others? Please.
Well, one of the things I think is really important is the way in which our scholarship can inform our community. And the work that I do is really based on examining my own practices. And one of the reasons why I picked that up is because as an LDS person working in an LDS institution, studying the process of teaching and learning, then if in my data I have the voice of students talking about religious principles and things like love and caring and inspiration and wisdom, then because I do qualitative work, it allows you to bring that voice into the larger academic community in that discussion. And so it relates a lot to what Jim said, because his work, my participation in the seminars has helped me to get clearer and clearer about metaphysical beliefs in relationship to my scholarship. And then that gives you confidence in being able to negotiate that relationship between what it means to be human and what it means to be human from my perspective and how that might connect.
Stephanie, do you see that relating to the Jacobsons in some ways, of the framers, as a critique or as a...
I struggled with the same thing that Richard brought up, and that is, I think that our beliefs have a fundamental and subtle difference that is so profound that it's very difficult to clothe ourselves in approaches of other places. It isn't that I can't look to every one of those in the Baptist. I can see how I'm engaged in all of those ways of knowing. But I think that Irene's talk on being children of God, what does it mean to be a disciple scholar, which is all about action, how do we act. And Maxwell's assertion that the most important fundamental thing we do is be Christ. You know, and it makes it so that, not that I'm thinking of religions of Christ that they're trying to do that, but there's a fundamental difference. I remember standing in a national professional organization when I just barely came here to BYU and had small children and was teaching 15 credit hours and advising 300 students and was going out to present a paper. And I remember the deep, profound gratitude I felt to my Heavenly Father who had revealed to me on a paper so that I could read it and present. And I thought as I looked out the window, how many people are at this conference standing at a window, overcome with gratitude there in the hall? And I think it's, and think of Nirvana's God, but as my heavenly Father. And I think those subtle differences are so profound. It's not that. In fact, I think those frameworks they gave us give us interesting ways to think about it. And that profound and subtle difference. That having a cosmology and not a theology, and believing that our practice is more important, the relationships are more important, positions us here.
Wonderful comment. So we're getting at what is an LDS perspective. It isn't just about faith as ideas, it's about faith as action, and it's a becoming process. It's a process that changes us and enlightens us, I think, that changes us as well as enlightens us, as part of what you're saying as well. So some wonderful comments, please.
My question is to Ross Spencer. So we hear about those in the social sciences, how, of course, living the gospel helps you, to appreciate mankind and all those things. But my question to you, Ross, is as a physics scientist, as a physicist and astronomer, how do you think your beliefs have made you a better physicist? How do you incorporate that as you were asked when you were hired? I'm interested in that.
We're violating our script again,
I
but
know.
it sounds like a great question, Ross. Why don't you want to take a shot at it?
I've struggled with this the whole time I've been here. It's really
Yeah.
hard in the physical sciences and for mathematicians. It's really hard. We just don't make contact with our beliefs very often. And so the only way to not live in separate boxes is, for me at least, has been to pray about my research and pray about my teaching and try to ask the Spirit of my Heavenly Father to help me be better at both. But the subject matter doesn't overlap much.
And do your students know about your efforts to do that?
That's one of the things I'm worried about now. They may not.
Yeah.
Well, just seeing those, because we're supposed to love each other. So that's great for all these other, social sciences. But
Let's keep. Thank you. Wonderful question, and thank you, Ross, for being so candid. Yeah. Because you can't hear always.
Yeah. So just stand up and project. That'd be great.
Dennis, stand up and project. Be our first model.
The emphasis on the students, approaching the students as a whole person, and the faculty approaching them as a whole student, as a whole person. And I think that, I'm not certain they were bringing it out, but to me it has to do with being transparent, letting your deepest thoughts and feelings and concerns be evident in your motion. I was struggling with an administrator on campus and wondering what's the whole point of this whole thing. And so I had this dream, and I was back at Stanford, and the faculty were walking along in robes, and the students were over there dutifully doing their assignments and brushing by in this rank and everything like this. And then immediately I'm back into in our building. I'm walking down the hall, and there's John Benyon, who does these wonderful foreign kinds of things with students and personal writing. And the students are following him, and he's opening the door, and pretty soon they're right in his house. And I woke up and I'm trying to figure out what that dream was about. But somehow it's about the fact that you invite students into your personal world, so to speak, the things that you're concerned about. And that's a fundamental difference than this other kind of approach of teaching. Anyway, I was left thinking about that.
Thank you. Other comments, please, Lynn?
I'd like to make a comment about Jim's question, which, by the way, in your introduction of him, you left out my favorite thing in Jim's introductions. He always says, I was the first in my family to graduate from high school.
High school?
Jim's question and Ross's sort of dilemma that he's so kindly sharing seems to me comes from, about my School of Ed folks right here, most of us teach the way we were taught, right? Most of us research the way our mentors, researchers, advisors taught us, at Stanford and Wisconsin and Cal Berkeley, where John Tanner and I were in the 60s, kind of dating ourselves here. I can promise you there were no gospel insights invited or allowed at Cal Berkeley in the 60s and probably not today. So if we don't know how to do this, that's very understandable. I mean, children raised in orphanages have difficulty being parents when that time comes because they didn't see that model. And we haven't seen the model, so we're trying to invent it. And that's what's so inspiring about yesterday and today, that we're all here at whatever stage we might be, those who've been doing it all along, or those who are saying, wow, what would that be like? How would I do it? But I want to give everyone permission, because of how we've been taught and how we've learned to research, to say, oh, no wonder I don't know how to do this.
Steve?
Richard, you might want to comment more on this later. Richard got me thinking yesterday about something he said at our table, and I think maybe one of the differences about what we do here is why we do what we do. Richard, you commented you do scholarship because you're supposed to. At first I thought, well, that doesn't sound very fun, but as I thought a little bit more about what you might have meant by that, just comment some more on that. One of the reasons I'm here, and I do what I do, is because I really have felt called. I felt like this is the Lord, this is where He wants me to be. That opens up some possibilities. The reasons that I do things changes how I do it, how I approach it. So I think our motivation, our drive behind what we do, that sense of calling and contributing to the kingdom, that gives us both a sense of duty to do some things well, but also has us want to focus on students and things to approach might be different. So I think that may be something that the students should be looking for.
Wonderful comments. David, let's and then Craig, let's have a couple more and then move.
One of the things I think is very different about the church and the way other people in academia and other religions do it is a person has to be trained in ministry to have those kind of callings. Whereas we call people without training and depend on them to receive what they need from the Holy Spirit. And I think the reason that I use undergraduates in my research from the moment they show up and are saying, I'm willing to work, is because of that's how I was socialized as a Latter-day Saint. So I think that may be an important part, going back to the behavior thing, as to how the church is different at BYU. It can be different because we have this idea, we can get them in there starting to do something right away, because if they feel like, I want to do this, then there's a way. I think that's very different.
And the Lord will help them out of the Spirit. Yeah, interesting. Craig.
So I was struck in one of the chapters, the discussion from the Jacobsons, that when we try to integrate, in essence, we are trying to be both, in my case, economist and religious philosopher. And quite frankly, like David was saying, I'm not as well trained on the religious philosophy side. And we're supposed to be university caliber academics. And we probably should not fall back on Sunday school level thinking. Sorry, that was pejorative. When we try to integrate.
He'll have a chance to get you, that's right.
The thing that has struck me over my years here is that the remarkable thing about God and our faith in God is not only does He know everything about economics and econometrics and markets, but He knows everything about physics and psychology and geography and geology and, pick your discipline. And the amazing thing about our belief system is we aspire to be like that, which to me says, wow, what fun that I get paid to be a learner. And that's been a wonderful part of being here.
Great comments. There are others, and I want to get you involved. What I want to do is kind of pull us now to, and hope we'll keep thinking about these kinds of comments. You've set a wonderful stage as we're now going through looking at some implications broadly and then coming back to, so what does this mean for me? But the first question I want us to ask, and you can tell we haven't really addressed this part of what they were presenting. It's the current research that they're doing on what's happening in the academy. The academy's changing. It was like Lynn's description of Berkeley when she and John were there in the 60s. That's probably still, you're saying, probably still the case. And I think that's one of the questions. How much has it changed? Is it changing? And if so, to the extent that it is, what difference does that make for BYU, for us as part of BYU? What are the implications? And I'd love to get the panel to at least comment on that. What are the implications, given what we've just been saying about an LDS perspective or an emerging one, or what's unique about us, given that the academy is perhaps opening up some more, that there is, and they talk about those characteristics as at least we ought to be like gays and lesbians and at least at the table. Whether they respect us or not, it's a different world. It's a world where we're in a dialogue, maybe a clamorous dialogue, is to Sandel's language at Harvard, but at least we're at the table, supposedly. What does that do for us? For good or for ill? Anybody want to comment on what are the implications for BYU, given this change that they're mapping, the emergence of at least some openness to religion, to religious discussion, from secularist, where there is no inclusion of religion, to secular, where religion is one of the facts of nature, one of the facts of our life. Comments? Richard?
Well, I think overall it's a good thing. I mean, I think it's especially a good thing for students and probably for faculty who feel able to be more fully themselves and get some nourishment spiritually. I'm a little wary because in the New Testament, I think there's a scripture that says, "He who is not against us is for us," and one that says, "He who is not for us is against us." So we have to pick our compatriots carefully. I think one of the dangers of academia opening up is what you can't defeat, you assimilate. And if we're not really careful, they could have, the discourse could take some turns that delete from it all of the things we wanted to accomplish by getting it as part of the discourse. And for Latter-day Saints, I think it's a good thing. We partner with who we can, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I think our associations with other faiths is sort of like the dangers of having a cat for a pet, because if it's big enough, it would eat you. So I think we're in a unique position, but I'm all for it. I think it's great.
You're all for it, sort of. Depending on the size of the cat and how sharp the claws are, it sounds like. Other comments?
Okay, well, I have written down here, if the role of religion is changing, what does this imply for BYU? And I wrote down, not much.
Say some more.
We're just a little weird, and we probably have always been more open to this than any other university in the country, except maybe some small colleges that are like us.
You don't see it changing much here.
I don't see how it could change very much. I mean, it's not our students.
That's right.
And our students come with a religious background and a desire for meaning already.
Any other comments from the panel? Yvonne?
Well, I would say in my discipline, it's difficult to engage scholars at other universities on the topic of religion, but you can engage them often on processes and principles related to the avant-garde versus traditional values. I think a lot of 20th century art, for example, was throwing out the old and devaluating all of the traditions surrounding what was then the visual arts, or even music, as we've seen, or even theater. And there's a lot of experimental stuff going on out there in theater and music and visual arts and dance that we probably have to sort of step back from and say that wouldn't be the kind of thing that an LDS scholar would engage in. It's too controversial. It would never run here at BYU, nor should it. But on the other hand, I find it interesting right now that outside of the academy, there's a wellspring of activity surrounding notions like beauty and traditional values that have been upheld for centuries, before certain conceptual artists devalued those. And so I find that encouraging, and I find that those conversations are able to happen and often happen where you find that there is a commonality of traditional goals and traditional values and a sense of meaning and a sense of belief that surrounds those kind of virtues. And I think all of us would say, is there one of us in here that wouldn't be moved by music or by the arts in some way in our religious and weekly devotions?
In some ways, we're becoming avant-garde as the terrain, because we're like the Indians with their artifacts and music or something that is now, it's avant-garde to pay attention and to that diversity and be at the table. So
it's been out of vogue long enough that now it's...
now
it's
like an old tie, it's maybe coming back into... Are there, Jim, okay, other comments about that, please?
Well, I think that the opening of the academy has had huge implications in my own work.
Which is what?
I'm in education, and I look at how my students' spiritual beliefs influence their work with multicultural students and English language learners. And I've had multiple experiences as I've presented my work, either in publication or at different academic conferences, where people have come up and said, I can't believe you're from BYU. You're so open-minded. You're thinking of these things. And it's, for me, all about missionary work, because I'm doing nothing that, I'm just doing nothing uncommon. This is what we do, but people don't know about it. Or people, stereotype us. And so I think as we increasingly bring our beliefs, now it works really easily in my field, perhaps not so easily in other fields, but as we bring our spiritual beliefs and those of our students into our research or into our methodology, like Stephanie was talking about, we have more and more chance to show that to the world at large and have those kinds of responses. And I welcome those and I love them because they change people's minds about what Mormons are, about what BYU does, and it builds bridges, but not in ways where the cat can eat me, because I've established what I am first and what I believe first. And then they're coming to me and saying, well, I didn't know we had that in common, or those concerns, or whatever they are. So I see it as a real missionary opportunity.
Thank you. Craig?
Just picking up on something Richard said, in our doctrinal discussions, we've got our own jargon and way of talking about things. The dialogue has been going on for a long time. But if you move into, for me in the business world, when we talk about ethics and the interaction with others, if we think we have an insight from our gospel, it's not for us to bring them into our jargon and our dialogue, but for us to go into theirs and figure out, is this an idea that actually stands up, given the best thinking, the best of the literature? And if so, it's going to stand on its own 2 feet in that jargon and in that setting, and will be an influence there for discovering better ways of thinking.
It's a key trade-off for us, isn't it? That is part of the implication for us now in this changing religious world. An opening to dialogue is an invitation to get into that public square and to have the conversation, but now we're declawed in that, and I'm thinking of the example of it's President Packer when he's here getting an EDD, I think, and he's sitting in a class, and they're having a philosophical discussion. It probably was about metaphysics, or and I think it was about faith and reason, as a matter of fact. But he says for several days this debate goes on, and he and one other person in the class are squaring off, and he's trying to defend the value of prayer and enlightenment that comes from other sources, and the other person is taking a philosophically very different point of view, and they each have their second. And after 2 or 3 of these sessions in class, the second of the other person in the class stops President Packer as he's leaving the class and says, "You're losing the debate, aren't you?" And he says, "Yeah, you're right, I am." He's trying to put it in philosophical language, and the other man said, you know why, don't you?" "No, help me." "You're out of context." And his point was, you're using the wrong language. And as President Packer came back and started talking about prayer and faith and action and keeping the commandments and what's happened to him, he carried the day in that group. So how much of this, when we talk about Prop 8 and where we stand on gay and lesbian issues and what's doctrinal and what's not, These are not, and I'm looking at Lynn over here, who goes out and does a whole lot of that from a legal point of view. This is not easy to be in the public square with a set of beliefs and dealing with, okay, here's me, and I can share my language, but they don't understand all that language. How do I do that, and how do our students do that in an ethical setting? The opening of the academy is an opportunity, but is it one that we're prepared to take? And how far does it go? It's fraught with some danger, I suspect. Yeah, Steve?
Tim, this might be something that would be good for you to address. I think we're talking about, in my mind, there's a difference.
Stand up, Steve.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Sorry.
Jim,
Thank you, Jim.
Talk about this a little bit. In my mind, there's a difference between being an apologist and being a critical scholar. And this approach that I think Richard's been talking about, you've been talking about, is kind of more an approach an apologist would use, in the sense of, I've already accepted this as being true for other reasons, and I'm going to look to my scholarship to support this position I've already taken. Whereas, as a scholar, most of us have been trained to say, I'm going to start with a blank slate, I'm going to gather the data that I can find within the restrictions of my discipline, and say, okay, where does that lead me? What does that say? And maybe we need both approaches here. Maybe Hugh Nibley would be the classical example of an apologist, where he just said, this is true, let me go out and see what I can find that supports this. But I think we've had successful LDS scholars that have also taken the other approach. I'm kind of curious about, do both work here? Do we have an obligation as LDS scholars to just be apologists and start from revealed truth and then work out from there where we ought to go?
Can I,
please?
Immediately, I've never considered myself an apologist, because for me the process is a little different from saying, okay, this is what I know to be true, now how do I defend it? The process for me has been, this is what I know to be true, and if it is true that it ought to work, and let me look at what the other theories are saying and doing and what they apply. So the goal isn't to defend this by my scholarship. The point is to do good scholarship in terms that come right. Now, I have a personal confidence of what that will be, but in response to Craig's earlier question, I don't need to be a religious philosopher to do this. I just need to be a darn good academic in my own field. And then that ties in with your question. I guess my approach is, I do not and have never loved nor respected ideas. I refuse to. I love and respect people, and people are often affected by ideas, and so I have an eye to that. But I don't set out to validate what I know to be true. This has to stand on its own merits in the discipline. And if I have trouble with something else, then we deconstruct it and show why that's a lousy idea on its own merits. So it's not classical apologetics, at least as I understand it. Sorry, Jim.
No, I don't have much more to add. I was going to say, I guess I don't see, there is a difference, I think, between what we usually think of as apologetics and saying something like, suppose you're a physicist, you know that things fall. Now, how to explain that? There could be, you could take Newton, you can take contemporary physics. There are various ways of doing it, and you can try to think about what's the best way and how to make sense of it, but you would never start from the blank slate that says, well, I don't know whether things fall. So this is going back to Richard's claim that some things are the case, and explaining how they are the case or what it means to say they are, I don't think that's really quite the same as apologetics, though I do think, if you believe in revealed religion, you do start with some things that are the case. And sometimes I don't understand what it means for them to be the case, and I have to try to figure that out and think about them.
And I want to get to Rick and then Jack back here. But part of the issue is when we're talking about homosexuality, for example, and what it means to be in a world that's changing to some extent, we've almost been disaccredited in several different programs on this campus by the APA, the American Psychological Association, that comes in and says, you don't hire gay and lesbian faculty, and you don't allow students to come who are practicing acting out as gays and lesbians or who favor that as students, and so we're going to discredit you. And it's been nip and tuck. It's been difficult for us. We have to have a way to, on the one hand, say This is something that is the case for us. And then do we have research that is able to demonstrate what it is we believe, and do we have a scholarly approach to how we train our students? And it turns out that because we were such good scholars, number one in psychology, because we had dealt with this quite well, our students need to learn how to deal with gay and lesbian clients. How will they deal with them? Have they been out and having that practice? Do they know how to say that here's who I am and who are you and do you want to work with me? They had handled that very well. And as a result, when push comes to shove, the national committee that looks at that says, well, they're doing well enough, we'd better do it. Besides that, we have some friends in court. We have some senators who were saying, we'll disenfranchise you, APA, if you don't allow a religious exception in this current world that's more open to secular, that is, religion is part of the environment. So it isn't either or, but it seems like there's probably both here, that we'd better be pretty good at knowing what we believe and why, and how to, but also how to talk about that in another language, and how to be very good scientists to have some credibility.
Can I just add one thing?
You want to go ahead?
And maybe it's just because I'm in a very slippery discipline relative to some of the other sciences, but I think we also ought to be critical scholars of our own field in the sense that, well, is this established and what are the assumptions upon which it's established and just how good is the research? And those are sort of easy pickings in some of the social sciences, a little harder in some of the hard sciences, but that's the other half of this equation of how you do this. You try to establish in good scholarly work for what we believe to be the case, and then you look and say, well, what's the case on the other side? Is this more consensus than data, more consensus than analysis? And so we have to be critical. Sorry.
Yeah, Rick?
Yeah, I just wanted to reaffirm my belief in what Richard is saying. I think he's hit upon a very important point in that this, to me, is scholarship based on faith. Faith in true religion. True religion being tethered in truth. There is no fear. There's nothing that we have to be afraid of. Now, in some of the disciplines, as you said, some of the disciplines, it's much more difficult to define what is true, which is why when I was a senior at BYU, double majoring in political science or genetics, I chose to go into genetics, because it was much easier and much more comfortable for me to be able to define truth in that discipline. My hats off to all of you philosophers and others. But I think that is critical. To me, that is very, very liberating about the gospel. And I think, in a sense, depending on how we define apologetics, everyone is an apologist, because everyone has those preconceived notions, as I think the Jacobsons point out very, 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 very articulately in their book and in their approach, that we all have preconceived notions and meta-questions that affect the way we look at the world. And to me, being able to march forth and not be worried about, wow, what if there's evidence for Asian DNA in the Americas? The Book of Mormon won't be true. Well, guess what? We believe in truth. We believe in embracing all truth. And when the church recognizes something as truth, they may go so far as to change the explanatory introduction to the Book of Mormon to reflect that truth as an accepted entity.
Thank you. Jack, you had a comment?
I want to come back to the point about the opportunities that this new development, and I thought the Jacobsons did a wonderful job of anecdotally telling us what's going on out there. It resonated with my experience. I think that we are needed in the academy, and we will be invited into the academy because people now want to know what is a Mormon position on a certain issue. We need to know what their big questions are and be prepared to answer those questions from a Mormon perspective. I can give several examples of this. Well, it was a year ago, I was invited to speak to the Christian Ethical Society in England. They wanted to know, what do Mormons make of the Sermon on the Mount, because they were having a whole conference on the Sermon on the Mount as an ethical foundation. I was the first Mormon to ever be invited to that group. And I had to be able to speak in their language, but they didn't want me really to be talking their language. They wanted me to be contributing to what they might learn from us. As a law professor, I was invited 2 years ago to speak at Fuller Theological Seminary on what is a Mormon perspective on law and leadership. And I think I was the first Mormon to ever speak at Fuller Theological Seminary. But again, it was the same question. They wanted me to be informed and able to talk on their terms, but they were really interested in what we as Mormons would have to say to contribute to that dialogue. Now, I guess this means we have to be bilingual, as Maxwell always encouraged us to be. We have to be able to understand and read in their language, but maybe more speak still in our own. And I think there are lots of opportunities like this, and I think this is a historic occasion for us here at BYU to be talking this way. We need to spend more time, I think, asking these questions, anticipating where they will come, and working out, well, what would I say if I had an opportunity come my way? If those opportunities are there, if we're prepared, I believe that the Lord will open the doors for us in coincidental and really unusual ways that we can't even anticipate how it will be that someone will become aware that we might have something to contribute to that conversation. If we're prepared, the Doctrine and Covenants says we shall not fear. But if we're not prepared, I don't think we can expect the Lord to open the way for us to go and fall on our face. So we've got to really do our homework. And so I think it is a great opportunity for us. And if I could take one last second to put in a plug for BYU Studies. I think that BYU Studies, which has celebrated its 50th anniversary, is a place where lots of this kind of thinking has actually gone forward. And we weren't trained at Stanford or Berkeley, at Oxford or Duke or wherever we were to do this kind of thing. But we have in BYU Studies a reservoir of examples of people like Nibley, who was more of a scholar than an apologist. He's more critical of Mormonism than most people think. We've got Truman Madsen, we've got Bob Thomas, you go down the list. Terry Warner. I don't want to start singling out anybody, but hundreds of our best predecessors have done things that I think we can really take advantage of. I think our next job is to be more descriptive. We have to talk about, to describe what it would be to be a Mormon response without being prescriptive to anybody. And publishing in BYU Studies is a way to get those things in circulation. We'd love to hear from you.
You're welcome for the moment for a paid political. I didn't even have to pay me for that. Kent, last comment on this, and then I want to move to what you've just teed up, I think, Jack, which is what are the implications, what are the contributions BYU scholars could make in this kind of world? Kent?
Well, I appreciate what Rick said about the openness, and Bob mentioned in the outset, reading from several different sources, that all truth, we can embrace it and not be afraid of it, because it won't contradict, anything that should be frightened by that. I'm reminded of a visitor that came a few years ago to our college. He was one of the best geneticists we could find in the country. We had an issue, we brought in 3 people to discuss about the relationship of DNA and genealogy. And he said, how did the Mormon Church, how is it they were so wise back in the days of Darwin not to take an official stand against evolution? How were they able to leave themselves an opening? And it's made me think of several things that, if these are my own thoughts. I spent a lot of time in Islamic countries, and I thought, what if they embraced the gospel and the patriarch gave them the religions to Abraham through Ishmael? Wouldn't that be fantastic? Or some people say, well, that's blasphemous. But some of these truths, what if we found out that homosexuality was inherited, at least half of it? What a relief that would be to some of the people who suffer from same-sex attraction. So there's a lot of these things that we could be open to, and yet I sense we're afraid to because it challenges what we think our church held in the past. A lot of people don't know that the church hasn't taken official stand on that issue. So being open and able to go after the truth that Richard said, wherever it takes you, and being willing to say that harmonizes, as I see it now with a different perspective from someone else's point of view. To me, that's what's encouraging about our discussion.
Thank you. Can we talk, panel, for just a minute about what are the implications, what are the contributions, I should say, that BYU scholars could make in this kind of environment that the Jacobson are describing? What sorts of things do you see us uniquely able to contribute? You've already made some comments in that direction, but go ahead, Richard.
I think that we need to decide where in our own disciplines or how the gospel matters, just in case it's true, to ask ourselves that question. And it will matter more in some disciplines than others, and it will matter differently in some disciplines than others. And sometimes it will influence our practice and our teaching more than our scholarship, but we just have to be thoughtful about that, I think. The other thing that I think is most important is that we agree to push the disciplines with at least as much zeal as our critics and some among us self-styled intellectuals push the church. That is, whenever we say, truth will out, then people want to push against the doctrine of the church, but they leave the disciplines get a free pass on that. And so I think we need to be as critical of those disciplines as we are, as anyone is of the church. And just say, we may be looking through a very small window right now, and everybody knows the sciences always say that, but in my experience, it's not practiced too much. We should be as critical of those disciplines as we possibly can, because only then will truth will out. And don't accept the landmarks, the fences, and other things that others have put up for us. I think we have a wonderful opportunity to be on the forefront, if we will, and to do so in ways that will, in the end result, be faithful and help others be faithful.
Does that work for you, Ross? Can you apply what Richard just said?
Not in the physical sciences much. There's sort of no Mormon perspective on physics or chemistry.
I don't think so either. I didn't mean to apply that.
No,
that was what I wanted to establish.
Some disciplines are different. They're very different. There is something strange we see happening in our department, though, and it probably happens in other physical science departments. For some reason, LDS students come here wanting to do it. There was a period, sort of starting about 20 years ago, when physics almost died in America as an undergraduate major. We didn't experience that here. And people keep wondering why. What are you doing that makes it so you have a vibrant undergraduate physics program? And when we survey our students, they come that way. They really want to do it. There's something about the LDS worldview that the high school students pick up that makes them want to study the world. And we are pumping out chemistry majors and physics majors and mathematicians at a pretty good rate out of BYU, and people notice.
People have come to your department to ask you that question.
Yeah.
What are you doing, haven't they?
Yeah, we don't know what we're doing. But we're happy to have them come and give us some exposure.
But if you had a way to ask them what are their living questions and why is this important for them and how does it relate to their religion, is there some way that helps contribute to a world where people are wondering, not only does Ross Spencer know his vocation and why he's doing it, but also his students. Do they know how to talk about who they are in that context? Is there something that's not critiquing the field, but contributing people who know how to talk about being believing scientists?
Yeah, it sort of doesn't come up, actually, when they talk to us.
It's a question, but it sounded like an invitation, too. So go ahead, Bob.
Alan, I was just going to say, it's something I said at the very beginning, and I would sort of agree with something that Jack Boak said, which is, this in some context for me is historical, what's happening here, but I think part of going out and contributing is to understand the platform from which we're coming. And I think often if you step outside of your own discipline, you have a clearer idea as you come back into your discipline of what it is that you're trying to do, or what it is that you're trying to accomplish. I like this quote from Einstein, for example. He said, "Although I am a typical loner in my daily life, my awareness of belonging to the invisible community of those who strive for truth, beauty, and justice has prevented me from feelings of isolation." And I think if we come together and share those commonalities, it strengthens us, not only in our own disciplines, but as we go out and try to engage in the conversation with others at other places.
Thank you.
I want to follow up on something that Ross said that I think is very important, and that is, I mean, he said it, jokingly, we don't know what we're doing. I think that's often the case, that we don't know what we're doing, and I think that the reflection on it's probably helpful. But I think that we also ought to be willing to trust the fact that if we have the Holy Ghost and if we have the truth and if we're sincere about what we're doing, that there's a good chance that what we're doing is the right thing. That we ought not to, I mean, as I said, I like this discussion that we're having, I like this conference, but I don't think we ought to get, my grandmother used to say, our panties tied up in a knot. I don't think we should get too uncomfortable with the fact that we don't know what we're doing. Sometimes these are things that are not completely clear, and I'm not positive that it really helps to get them completely clear, though I'm all in favor of, I'm a philosopher after all, I'm all in favor of talking.
Any other comments? Yeah, Dennis.
I was just thinking, the contributions that we can make here at BYU, we've talked about being bilingual. And it's often said that if you learn a foreign language, that's the key to understanding your own language much, much better. And I just find that over and over, myself and other colleagues whose work that I appreciate so much, is that if you're trying to understand their language and what they're talking about, then all of a sudden this passage opens up, and this concept in the gospel is much more important than I'd ever thought of beforehand, because it helps me understand what's going on over here. And I think that that's part of what we need to do here at BYU, is have this openness towards seeing the gospel in fresh, new ways that we really couldn't see had we not been trying to grapple with some other language that we were trying to learn and learning our own.
Wonderful contributions. I think, Jane, have we finished the, what are you pointing to? Oh, okay. Are we about done? I think we're out of time, so let's make a couple of last comments. And
okay, I'll be quick. First, as a parent of a future physics major at BYU, I will tell you he's 16, and he tells me the reason he wishes to study is because he figures if he has to create worlds later, he better figure out how to study.
How far away are you from that?
My son. But as I was listening to the Jacobson's beginning introduction yesterday of the old soul and the silenced soul and this idea of the new soul that is entering the academy now, I thought of the obvious parallel to individuals as we go through life. We come as very childlike, people very willing to, our world just is about God as children. And then as we move into adolescence, we are silenced in some ways. We're struggling with how does our own individuality fit with religion. And then as they enter this university, I think that's when they begin to find out who they really are. So one of the opportunities we have as teachers is to help them along that path to converge their religious self with their individual, more secular self.
thank you. Thank you for such thoughtful, heartfelt, faithful, inspired comments. I think there's been just a wonderful spirit here and a sense of questions that we leave with. I don't think we all have the same question. In different disciplines, it's different. How bilingual we have to be, how much we have to be religious philosophers, but the role of the Spirit, the kind of opportunities that we have to be inspired in what we're doing, even if we don't know what we're doing. There's quite some wonderful encouragement and openness that I think now leads us into the next set of sessions. We'll take a 10-minute break now, and then in this room, if I've got it right, if I remember the program right, we have the teaching session that Russ Osgathorpe will chair with 4 colleagues who we'd be looking at specifically, or talking about specific things that they do in the classroom but across various disciplines, in some of the sciences, some of the social sciences, etc. What is it that I do in the classroom, they will be saying. We'll also be down the hall in room 105 with a scholarship session. Dave Wetton is ill, and so he asked me to substitute for him, but I'll be moderating a session there with 4 scholars in a variety of different ways, talking about how they, in their particular discipline, bring the gospel to bear, whether explicitly or implicitly, and we'll be having that conversation starting at, let's say now, 10:35, so when we've got refreshments back here in the back, and as you remember, restrooms here just outside the door and at the other end of the hall as well. So thank you very much.